Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Bible Study Fellowship this evening. If you will, go ahead and take out your hymnal, stand up, and let's sing together hymn numbered 577, 577, God of Grace and God of Glory. Now, we're kind of few in number in the auditorium here, so we're going to have to sing the other guys in. So join with me and sing 577. God of grace and God of glory, on thy people pour thy power. Crown thine ancient church's story, bring her bud to glorious flower. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the facing of this hour. For the facing of this hour. Lo, the hosts of evil round us scorn thy Christ, assail his ways. Fears and doubts too long have bound us, free our hearts to work and praise. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the living of these days, for the living of these days. Cure thy children's warring madness, bend our pride to thy control. Shame our wanton selfish gladness, rich in things and poor in soul. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage, lest we miss thy kingdom's goal. Lest we miss thy kingdom's goal. Save us from the resignation to the evils we deplore. Let the search for thy salvation be our glory evermore. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage, serving thee whom we adore. Serving thee whom we adore. Thank you all very much. You may be seated.
Thank you, David. If any of you guys ever want to come up and lead the song, hey, we'll sign you up. Let me know. Well, I'm so happy to welcome you back this week live. Nearly 2 years ago, most of us had never heard of Zoom, but when everything got shut down in March of 2020, I thought we were going to have to end the BSF class for the rest of that class year through May, but I think we only missed 1 week of class. The next week, we found Zoom and started learning how to navigate the online world of BSF classes. It didn't go real well, but it was a good start. So much good has come out of Zoom. As I reflect back on it, we're able to meet face to face even when the churches were closed, even if it was video. You know, we had snowbirds in our class every year, people to go to Florida or somewhere warm. Those people were able to stay with us on Zoom. We've had people that have dropped out of our class because they were physically unable to get here on Tuesday night. Maybe they were a little older. Well, some of those people came back for Zoom. And then the other thing that happened last year is we had friends and family of class members who lived in other states, and they were able to plug into Zoom. So there's been a lot of blessings from it. In fact, this week, Tony is officially joining our class. Hello, Tony. Tony lives in Minnesota and somehow ran across us. He used to be in a BSF class somewhere and somehow found our lectures online and started following us, and he's in a class now. He was in BSF before in a live class, but now he's in a city that doesn't have one, so he joined one of our groups this week. So, and also I saw a new man here tonight, so I want to welcome you. I'm Bill Meyer, by the way. So even though most of us are live, we currently have 4 online groups, so I see us doing that on into the future, still having an online offering even though we're meeting live. And I know I also want to say, some of you, if you're not ready to come back, if you're in a live group but you're not quite ready to come back yet, we'll put you in a virtual group for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks if that makes you more comfortable. So we want to be flexible. Since we did have snow since last time we met, I was going to talk about what our snow policy was. If Jefferson County schools are closed and there's snow on the ground, this church will probably be closed. If it's one of those, it was really cold in the morning and there was a little dusting of snow, it still might be possible that we're able to meet, even if the schools are closed. Now, they tell me the Eastern Heights Baptist Church is always closed over there if the schools over there are closed. So if it snows, just look for a text or an email from your group leader. And of course, if you're in an online group, it doesn't matter. If you're in a live group, you might be able to pivot to Zoom. So hopefully we won't have any more problems with that, but if we do, you know what to do. Kids, we have a great school program downstairs. Back in the day, we had like 20 kids down there, and of course, COVID just messed us all up. And of course, being off for a couple of weeks, made it harder. So I'm just going to encourage you, until we get back up to 20, I'm going to promote our children's program every week. So if you've got kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews, it's for boys and girls, grade 1 through 12, we can accommodate you. It's a great program, and they will definitely learn the Bible down there. So I'm going to keep promoting that. Let me pray, and then I'll get into my remarks tonight. Thank you, Lord, that the gates of Hades, or in our case, COVID, hasn't been able to prevail against this Louisville area class here of BSF. Thank you for allowing us to have a place for the last 30 years to discuss the Bible and to learn more about you. Thank you for us being able to be back in person this week. I pray that everything I say tonight will be to your glory and to the glory of Jesus Christ, and it's in his name I pray. Amen. So we have some interesting contrast in this week's passage. We once again see the religious establishment challenging Jesus. Jesus makes it clear to his disciples that these religious guys are not the true representatives of God. Then we also see Jesus ask the most important question, I think, in the Bible: who do you say I am? That's not an optional question. Every single person who's ever lived has to answer that question one way or the other. And then in our last division, Jesus' disciples, as well as us, learn the true meaning of being his followers. So if you turn to chapter 16 of Matthew, either electronically or in your real Bible, and follow along. I'm not going to read a lot of the passages, so don't want you to get lost. So I always like to know where I think Jesus is located. That's because the Bible is not just a story. It's about real people in real time and space and real places. When we left him last week, in last week's passages, he was on the northern shore, I think, of the Sea of Galilee. I'm going to assume that's where he is in this first division, either there or somewhere near there, before he and his disciples traveled to Caesarea Philippi. And why is that important? Well, in verse 1, it says the Pharisees and the Sadducees came to Jesus. And I showed you this slide last week. We learned that that's a trip of like 100 miles. It wasn't just something you could just run down the hill up the hill to Caesarea Philippi or Capernaum and run back. I mean, it was a major trip for these guys, taking several days. It's interesting to me that the Sadducees are mentioned for the first time tonight as coming to see Jesus. Previously, it was the Pharisees. Now, as we've talked about before, the Pharisees were more of the working class kind of religious leaders. They gained their position through rigorous study and pious living. The Sadducees, on the other hand, gained their positions through wealth and power. They were the upper class religious leaders. So I see the Pharisees traveling all this way to challenge Jesus and to see what's going on. But the Sadducees is a different matter. They were, I think, more concerned with their position rather than strict observance of God's word. I see their arrival on the scene as reflecting an increased concern that this Jesus fellow might upset the apple cart, so to speak, with respect to their positions. I believe that they might have come to evaluate whether Jesus and his followers might eventually supplant the religious status quo in Israel. And the other thing we know from history is that the Pharisees and the Sadducees didn't really get along that well, but here they seem to be united in their opposition to Jesus. So they start off, they ask Jesus for a sign from heaven. Now, Jesus had been performing probably hundreds of miracles in that region. All of these are not documented in the Bible. The gospel writer John said that if everything Jesus did was written down, the whole world wouldn't be able to hold the books that would be written. These religious leaders have been following Jesus around for some time, at least the Pharisees. If these leaders had not personally themselves seen any of Jesus' miracles, they would have certainly heard about them firsthand from the people that they were talking to. Jesus responds to this request for a sign. He's basically saying, well, they know how to predict the weather from the appearance of the sky, but yet they aren't able to understand what's going on right in front of them. These guys had more knowledge about the scriptures than anyone, yet they missed understanding what was going on with Jesus. There had been so much evidence to where they should at least have considered whether Jesus could be the Messiah. He was teaching with authority. He healed sickness and infirmities. He cast out demons. He even raised people from the dead. He had thousands and thousands of people following him around in this rural area. He was fulfilling many of the predictions in the Old Testament of who the Messiah was going to be. Now, these religious leaders didn't have to accept Jesus as Messiah right away, but they should have at least gotten together and considered the evidence before they flat out rejected him. Jesus calls these guys wicked and adulterous. I'm sure they were a little indignant about that. He said that the only sign they were going to get was the sign of Jonah. Now, back in chapter 12, Jesus gave more information about what he was talking about there. He said that just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days, the Son of Man would be in the heart of the earth for 3 days. Now, of course, I presume that none of the people there understood this reference to Jonah. As I was thinking about it this week, Jesus' mention of Jonah was more for his disciples and followers in the future. Once he had died and been raised from the dead, they would have understood this reference, but the people who heard him that day, I'm sure didn't really have any context to understand what Jesus was saying about Jonah. In verse 5, it says Jesus and his disciples get in a boat to go across the Sea of Galilee. He tells his disciples to be on their guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees about what they were preaching. So these disciples must not have been listening to Jesus very well, or I don't know what's going on with them, but they somehow think he's talking about them not bringing bread along for the trip. In verse 8, Jesus says, well, they have little faith because they're worried more about their physical needs. He reminds them that he fed a group of 5,000 and 4,000 men. And then in verse 12, it says that his disciples finally get it. They need to be on guard about what the Pharisees and the Sadducees teach. And I have a principle for you. Examination of the evidence helps people know who Jesus is. There was plenty of evidence for these guys, and they just flat out ignored it and rejected it. There's plenty of evidence today. And my question is, how do you filter teachers and videos and books and so forth to determine that the information presented is consistent with the Bible? What these religious leaders were teaching was not the things of God, according to Jesus. And, today we have all kinds of people teaching all kinds of stuff. My wife is working with a woman who's very interested in Christianity, but she's not a Christian yet. And she's got Christian friends that send her things. And Becky looks at some of those things, and they're just wild. I mean, just crazy stuff, because she always helps her kind of work through them. So she keeps sending her back to the Bible, going back to the Bible. So there's a lot of crazy stuff out there, but how do you filter that? I'll put these up at the end as I always do. In verse 13, we learn that Jesus and his disciples travel from the Sea of Galilee area north to the town of Caesarea Philippi. That's as opposed to Caesarea Maritime, which is on the coast. Now, before I went to Israel in 2013 on my trip, this was just the name of another town. I didn't really have any context for it, but it's about, as I said, 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, and it's really not on the way to anywhere, back then or today. It wasn't like they were passing through this town to get to another town. I mean, even if they were going to Syria, they would have gone a different way, Damascus. Your notes will mention that it's a beautiful area, and it is. It was one of the most the prettiest areas I saw. I didn't know this, but this is the area where the Jordan River starts. Mount Hermon, I'll show you that on a map in a minute, has snow in the wintertime. Matter of fact, they have a ski resort there. And the snow melts on Mount Hermon when it gets warmer, and it collects in underground reservoirs under the mountain, they told me. And during the rest of the year, the water kind of springs forth from underneath Mount Hermon to feed the Jordan River. So this is just a couple of tributaries here that I took a picture of the Jordan River. So if I ever went to Israel again, Jerusalem was cool and all that, and the Dead Sea and all that, but this was really a pretty area, this whole area around that. Got another map for you. So on this map, the bottom arrow points to the Sea of Galilee area. That's Capernaum, kind of his home base. The arrow at the top points to Caesarea Philippi. And right above that, to kind of, I guess, the right, you see Mount Hermon. One thing I've learned about Caesarea Philippi is that it was one of the most pagan places of that day. Here's an artist's conception of what it looked like back then. It's up against a cliff, and those are two pagan temples. The people who lived there worshiped the god Pan, P-A-N. That's the Greek god, you might remember, that's half man and half goat. Now, their worship of Pan, I read, apparently included a lot of sex and decadence. And I'm not really sure why Jesus took them there. Maybe to make a point later on. At any rate, they're in this place. While they're there, in this pagan place, Jesus asked them who people said he was. Now notice in verse 13, he refers to himself as Son of Man. It says, who do people say the Son of Man is? Now we've talked before about the fact this is a term used in, the prophet Daniel used for the coming Messiah. Jesus has already used this term like 9 times in the Gospel of Matthew. The disciples say, well, people have different opinions. Some think Jesus is John the Baptist, reincarnated. Some think Elijah, maybe Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. But then Jesus, in verse 15, says, but what about you? Who do you say I am? Peter jumps in and answers first. He says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. It drives me crazy when people say that Jesus never ever claimed to be anything other than a man. There's dozens, if not hundreds, of places in the Gospels where Jesus clearly refers to himself as exactly what Peter said he was, in one way or another. Messiah, Son of the living God. Now notice that Jesus doesn't correct Peter. Jesus doesn't say, oh, well, that's very nice of you, Peter, to say that, but I'm afraid you're thinking too highly of me. No, Jesus praises Peter for what he said in verse 17. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. He goes on to say in verse 18, and I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Jesus gives Simon a new name, Peter, which means rock. The footnote in your NIV Bible says that. So let me make a few points about this exchange. In my view, verse 15 is either the most important or one of the most important verses in the entire Bible. Who do you say I am? Now, I didn't want to ruin my reputation for using like this light switch slide like every other week, so gotta fit it in. But this is just one more situation among many where there's only two possible answers to the question that Jesus asked. He was Messiah, Son of the living God, or he was just a man. A variation of just a man is, well, he didn't exist at all. He's a figment of everyone's imagination. So, we have to answer like Peter that Jesus is, in fact, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Or we have to say he was just a mere man. There's no in-between position you can take. Now, I hope everyone here tonight and listening can answer Jesus' question the same way that Peter did. But if you can't, at least I hope you're working diligently through the Bible in an honest attempt to determine exactly who Jesus is. Now, if you don't like my light switch illustration and only giving you two choices, the Christian writer C.S. Lewis offers three alternatives to choose from in answering this question: who is Jesus? The first choice is liar. If Jesus was only a man and he knew he was only a man, then he was a liar. He wasn't who he said he was, and he just misled everyone his entire life. He even went to the cross to protect this lie. The second choice is lunatic. Jesus was only a man, but he was delusional and thought he was the Messiah. Even though he somehow performed miracles and spoke with great authority and clarity, he was some type of madman. The third choice is Lord, exactly who Peter said he was. If you look at all the available evidence, you have to come to the conclusion that Peter did, and that C.S. Lewis did, and that I did. Messiah, Son of the living God. Another thing I want to talk about is, how did Peter know this with such certainty? Did Peter's statement reflect only intellectual knowledge, or was it also a personal decision? Who or what was behind Peter's confession? I think these questions offer some good insights into how Peter came to his conclusion that Jesus was Messiah, and how we come to the same conclusion. I think intellectual knowledge is important. God gave us incredible minds, and he expects us to use them. But it's clear from the Bible that intellectual knowledge alone can't produce faith. Now, for me, Christianity has always made intellectual sense. Part of the reason is that there are no other good explanations about who we are and where we came from. Peter acted on the intellectual knowledge that he had about Jesus. He had to make a decision about who this Jesus fellow he was following around really was. Because of all that he saw and heard in being around Jesus all this time, he couldn't sit on the fence with respect to this important question. However, faith in Jesus can't be gained simply by intellectual knowledge and a personal decision. In verse 17, Jesus explains what's really needed to accept Jesus as Lord and Savior. It's a revelation from God the Father. In verse 17, Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." Now, verse 18 has been the subject of much discussion. "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." So what's Jesus talking about here? What's the rock on which Jesus will build his church? Been a lot of debate over the years. Let me give you several viewpoints. One viewpoint is it's Jesus himself. It's clear that Jesus is the architect of our faith and the cornerstone of the church. Jesus is in fact referred to as the cornerstone in several Bible passages. The main issue with this position is that it doesn't seem to be that's what Jesus meant in this passage. His focus was clearly on Peter. Second is Peter. The viewpoint is that Peter was the first leader of the church. That's the Roman Catholic position. Now, while the early church certainly had a high regard for Peter, there's no evidence in other scriptures that he became the one and only leader of the church after Jesus' ascension. And then next couple of weeks, we'll see in chapter 18 and in other Gospels, the disciples were arguing among themselves about who was the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So if Jesus had really appointed Peter as the leader, the one and only leader, then Peter clearly would have been the one who was greatest in the kingdom. The third option, there's more, by the way. You can read like books and books about this. The third is Peter's confession of faith. In this viewpoint, the rock refers to the confession of faith that Peter made and that all subsequent believers also give. I think maybe this has some merit because Peter alone did not build the church. The church was built on the evangelism of dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, then millions of Christ followers. Your notes also have some viewpoints on this. Now, I usually don't quote from the BSF notes because I assume you're going to read them, but they summed up this issue very well, so I'm going to read this in case you don't get to the notes. It says, regardless of the interpretation, the divine revelation and personal commitment to Christ reflected in Peter's confession set the course of the future of God's people. Jesus himself builds his church. Verse 19, another kind of interesting verse. Jesus talks about the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Again, there's a lot of discussion about exactly what he meant. In verse 18, Jesus says the gates of Hades will not overcome his church. So this is a picture I took at Caesarea Philippi, and this is what was called the gates of Hades. Jesus was right there. He might have actually pointed to it when he was talking to him. I'm just speculating. The pagans thought this cave was a direct path to the underworld. And it's interesting to me that Jesus used the term gate of Hades while he was at the gate of Hades. One Bible scholar I read pointed out that gates are generally defensive, not offensive. Gates are generally to keep things out. But the point here is that perhaps Jesus was challenging the disciples to go on the offensive against the powers of evil. If they did evil, the gates of Hades wouldn't be able to prevail against them. As he wrote, he didn't want his followers hiding from evil. He wanted them confronting it to storm the gates of hell. An interesting way to think about it. I personally think the keys represent the gospel, but there's lots of opinions about this. In my thinking, they unlock the power of the good news of Christ to reach the world. People who accept that gospel are loosed from the power of sin and death. Those who hear the gospel but don't respond in faith are still bound by sin. You can study this and come to your own conclusions. One thing I remind you from time to time is I'm not a Bible scholar, I'm an accountant. In verse 20, Jesus tells his disciples not to tell others that he was the Messiah. Interesting. We don't know exactly why Jesus didn't want them to tell after they realized it for themselves, but it may have something to do with Jesus' timetable and his eventual death and resurrection. He didn't want it to be sped up too much. So this is the only principle I could actually come up with, and Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Hard to argue with that one. And then my question is the same question Jesus asked: who do you say Jesus is? Again, I hope you said the same thing as Peter, or if you didn't, you're diligently working to the day when you can get there. My third division tonight is verses 21 through 28. As I mentioned before, the common Jewish understanding of what the Messiah would do when he came was different than what Jesus actually did. The Jewish Messiah was thought to be a conquering king. He'd drive out the Romans and he'd bring wealth and prosperity to the land. However, as often the case, God's plans are not our plans. In verse 21, Jesus begins to explain to his disciples that he would suffer and be killed in Jerusalem. He also said he would be raised to life on the third day. Peter is apparently upset about what he considers crazy talk from Jesus. In verse 22, it says that Peter rebukes Jesus. I looked up the word rebuke in the dictionary. It's defined as expressing sharp disapproval or criticism of someone because of their behavior or actions. Peter says These things are never going to happen to you, Jesus. Jesus, in turn, rebukes Peter, calling him Satan. Just a minute ago, he was praising him. He says that Peter's a stumbling block and doesn't have in mind the concerns of God, but only his human concerns. Now, I can sympathize with Peter. He's come to understand that Jesus is the long-promised Messiah. He's come to love and respect him. The last thing Peter can think about is Jesus dying, what he considers an untimely death. He's only 30-something. Peter doesn't seem to hear the part, did you notice, about Jesus being raised on the third day. In verse 24, Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." This had to be shocking to the disciples. We see the cross as a nice necklace or as an adornment on top of a church building. Jesus' disciples and the people of that day saw it as a cruel Roman instrument of torture and death. It wasn't the type of thing anybody would want to be associated with. Yet Jesus tells them they must take up their cross. Not only that, they must lose their entire life to find true life in Jesus. Likewise, we must lose our entire life to find true life in Jesus. We have to put our self-interests, our desires, our hopes and dreams secondary to the will of God. The call to be a disciple of Jesus and take up our cross and follow him is not an easy one. However, we will find rewards and great joy when we know we're doing the will of the Father. And my last principle is Jesus' followers embrace his cross in faith and self-denial. And this question is one that I use to challenge myself. How much time do you spend thinking about the things of the world instead of the things of God? It's one thing I like about preparing a BSF lecture. I got to think about the things of God, but I spend a fair amount of time, I'll have to admit, thinking about the things of this world. So next week, Peter's affirmation of Jesus as the Messiah is confirmed in the story of the Transfiguration. We see another story where he heals a little boy and tells his disciples that if they had faith of a mustard seed, nothing would be impossible for them. And then there's the incident where Jesus pays the temple tax. Actually, Peter goes and gets it out of the mouth of a fish to pay it. I think you remember that story if you've read it before. Let me pray, and then I will let you go for the evening. Thanks for being here. Lord, you've given us amazing minds to think and analyze and reason, and I pray that everyone would examine carefully the evidence of Christ before rejecting him. Thank you for providing Jesus, who was perfectly described by Peter as Messiah, the Son of the living God. And I pray that we would all have the faith and commitment and endurance to be a follower of Jesus, regardless of the cost. And it's in his name I pray. Amen.